Archaeological discoveries are pretty normal. Sometimes they find bones. Sometimes they dig up ancient tools. And sometimes they unearth something that should have stayed buried. A corpse, mummified in terror, its mouth twisted in an eternal scream. A skeleton with a brick shoved into its jaw, a medieval attempt to stop it from rising from the grave. A mass grave filled with over 120 bodies, their deaths still unexplained. These aren't just relics of the past. They're glimpses into forgotten horrors, lost tragedies, and rituals so unsettling they still haunt scientists today. These are 15 disturbing archaeological discoveries that scientists wish they never found. Number 15. The Gladiators of York. When archaeologists excavated a Roman-era cemetery in York, England, they expected typical burials. What they found instead was 80 skeletons, nearly all young men, and most of them decapitated. Their heads weren't randomly discarded either. They had been carefully placed, sometimes at their feet, sometimes between their arms. That's not how criminals were buried. So who were they? One leading theory suggests they were gladiators. Their bones showed extreme physical stress, healed wounds from bladed weapons, and even bite marks from large animals, possibly lions or bears, which gladiators famously fought in the arena. In some regions of the Roman world, victorious gladiators were allowed to ritually behead their fallen opponents. But another theory is darker. Some historians think these were rebels or soldiers, executed and buried as a warning to others. We don't know what happened to them, but our history is pretty messy. Number 14. The Lovers of Valdaro. Now, this will melt your heart. In 2007, archaeologists in Italy unearthed a hauntingly beautiful discovery, a pair of skeletons locked in a final embrace. Dubbed the Lovers of Valdaro, these two individuals, a young man and woman in their early 20s, had been buried face to face, their arms wrapped around each other, frozen in time for 6,000 years. Unlike typical Neolithic burials, where bodies are positioned neatly or in family groups, these two were deliberately arranged. But why? There were no signs of violence or disease, no battle wounds, no evidence of execution. Some believe they died together in a tragic accident and were later positioned as a symbol of eternal love. Others think it was a ritual burial, possibly even a sacrifice. Their embrace meant to symbolize a deeper cultural or spiritual belief. Whatever the truth, their remains stand as one of the most mysterious and strangely poetic discoveries in archaeology. Number 13. The Screaming Mummy. In 1886, a team of archaeologists in Egypt unwrapped a mummy that immediately gave them chills. Most mummies are carefully prepared, faces set in a peaceful expression. Well, as peaceful as a 3,000-year-old corpse can look. But this one? Its mouth was frozen open in a scream, its face contorted in agony. Even in death, it looked like it had died in sheer terror. This wasn't just any mummy. It was believed to be Pentower, the disgraced son of Pharaoh Ramses III. He had been involved in a plot to assassinate his own father, but when the coup failed, he was forced to take his own life, likely by poison. Unlike royal burials, his body was a mess, wrapped in impure sheepskin, with no inscriptions, no golden mask, nothing. The ultimate insult in Egyptian culture. Well, we don't know if it was a punishment in life or a curse in death. Pentower remains one of the creepiest mummies ever discovered. What do you say? Number 12. Mass Grave in Leicester. In 2024, archaeologists digging near a cathedral in Leicester, England, found something grim, a pit crammed with 123 skeletons. No coffins, no neat rows, just bodies, piled haphazardly, as if people had dumped them there in a hurry. That alone was eerie, but what made it weirder was that none of the skeletons showed signs of violent death. No battle wounds, no broken bones, no evidence of execution. So what happened? The grave dates back to the early 12th century, a brutal time of famine, disease, and war. At first, researchers thought it was the Black Death, but radiocarbon dating proved the bodies were buried 150 years before the plague reached England. Some believe they were victims of mass starvation, while others suspect something darker, that these people were outsiders or refugees, rounded up and possibly poisoned. Whatever happened, one thing is certain. Something terrible went down in Leicester that history forgot. Number 11. The Witch of Lugnano. In 2018, archaeologists excavating a Roman-era cemetery in Italy made a deeply unsettling discovery: the skeletal remains of a young girl with a large rock jammed into her mouth. Was she a vampire? Some say yes. Others say she was a witch. Dubbed the Vampire of Lugnano, her burial suggests that even in death people feared her. The remains date back to the 5th century, a time when malaria was devastating the region. The locals may have believed this child was cursed or could spread disease even after death. Other bizarre burials at the site included children with raven claws and toad bones placed near their bodies, clear signs of anti-witchcraft rituals. This suggests that Romans, like medieval Europeans, had their own superstitions about the undead. Whether she was truly feared in life or simply a victim of paranoia, one thing is certain: her grave tells a chilling story of ancient superstition and fear. Number 10. The Heslington Brain. Brains usually decompose within weeks after death. They're soft tissue, not meant to last. But in 2008, archaeologists in Heslington, England, found something that shouldn't have been possible: a 2,600-year-old brain perfectly preserved inside a skull. The rest of the body? Completely decayed. Skin, muscles, organs, gone. But the brain? Still solid. Scientists were baffled. No freezing, no chemicals. So how did it survive? The skull belonged to a man who had been hanged and then decapitated. His head was buried in wet, oxygen-poor soil, which might have slowed decomposition, but that still wouldn't explain why only the brain lasted. When scientists examined it, they found that proteins had clumped together, preventing it from breaking down like normal tissue. Even now, researchers don't fully understand why this brain survived when everything else rotted away. It's one of the best preserved ancient brains ever found. Number 9. The Mount Owen Claw. In 1986, explorers deep inside a cave in New Zealand stumbled upon something that made their blood run cold: a supermassive mummified claw, still covered in thick, scaly skin and long, razor-sharp talons. It looked like something straight out of Jurassic Park. We mean, just look at that thing. But this wasn't a dinosaur. It was the foot of a moa, a giant flightless bird that had been extinct for at least 500 years. The claw was so perfectly preserved that at first, researchers thought the creature had only recently died. The discovery sparked wild theories. Some cryptozoologists even suggested that moas might still exist, hiding deep in the remote forests of New Zealand. But most scientists believe the claw was simply a remarkably well-preserved relic, buried in a dry, oxygen-poor cave for centuries. Either way, one thing's for sure: if this was the first thing you found while exploring a cave, you'd probably rethink your life choices. Number 8. The Vampire of Venice. In 2009, archaeologists excavating a mass grave on the Venetian island of Lazaretto Nuovo found something straight out of a horror movie: a skull with a brick jammed into its mouth. And no, this wasn't some weird accident. It was done on purpose. During medieval plagues, people believed the dead could rise from their graves and spread disease. In some places, these undead beings were called revenants. In others, they were considered vampires. To stop them, gravediggers would shove a brick into their mouths, preventing them from feeding. This skeleton, now called the Vampire of Venice, belonged to a woman buried during a 16th century plague outbreak. When gravediggers reopened the pit to add more bodies, they saw her skull with blood seeping from her mouth, a natural process, but they didn't know that. Panicked, they assumed she was a vampire and forced a brick into her jaws. Well, medieval times was scary. Number 7. The Roopkund Lake skeletons. High in the Himalayas, at over 16,000 feet, lies Roopkund Lake, better known as Skeleton Lake, and for good reason. When the ice melts, hundreds of human bones are scattered along the shoreline, a chilling reminder of a long-forgotten disaster. Discovered in 1942, these skeletons date back as far as 1,200 years, and their deaths are shockingly uniform, massive skull fractures, as if something had rained death upon them. But there were no weapons, no signs of battle. Instead, scientists believe they were caught in a freak hailstorm, where softball-sized hailstones struck with such force that they caved in their skulls. Even stranger, DNA testing showed these people weren't from a single group. They came from different parts of the world, including the Mediterranean. What were they doing in the Himalayas together? A pilgrimage? A mass migration? No one knows. And that mystery is exactly why the legends surrounding Skeleton Lake still haunt researchers today. What do you think about it? Number 6. Sandby Borg. On the Swedish island of Öland, there's a site called Sandby Borg, an ancient ring fort that was once a thriving community. That is, until one day in the 5th century when everyone was slaughtered. Archaeologists excavating the site found bodies sprawled across homes and streets, many still lying in the exact positions they died in. None were buried. Their skeletons were just left to rot, a chilling sign that no one was left to bury the dead. But here's the weird part. Unlike typical Viking-era raids, nothing was looted. Jewelry, weapons, even livestock, all untouched. Whoever did this wasn't after riches. Some bodies showed signs of execution, with weapons still lodged in their bones. One skeleton had a sword sticking out of his ribs, a clear sign that someone really wanted to make sure he was dead. Was it revenge? A brutal show of power? Whatever happened, it was so horrifying that no survivors ever returned, leaving the site frozen in time, a massacre that history never recorded. All right, guys, now let's talk about Number 5. Polish vampire burials. The real story behind Eastern European vampires might be even creepier than the legends. Between the 1600s and 1700s, people in Poland took extreme precautions to prevent the dead from rising. Archaeologists have found skeletons buried with sickles over their necks, ready to decapitate them if they moved, and rocks wedged under their chins, ensuring their mouths stayed shut. Because the last thing you wanted was a corpse coming back to feed on the living. In 2014, researchers uncovered vampire burials in Drosko Cemetery. These weren't outsiders or criminals. They were locals, and they hadn't died in battle. Instead, they were likely victims of a cholera epidemic. Since diseases were poorly understood at the time, terrified villagers believed these rapid deaths meant the dead wouldn't stay dead. Their solution? Make sure they never had the chance to rise again. Whether they were right or not, their fear is still chilling centuries later. Number 4. The mummified lung. Whole-body mummies are eerie enough. But when archaeologists opened a stone sarcophagus in Paris in 1959, they found something way weirder. A skeleton and a single leathery lung, perfectly preserved while the rest of the body had decayed. The remains belonged to Queen Arnegunda, who ruled between AD 515 and 580. For decades, her mummified lung remained a scientific mystery. But in 2016, researchers finally pieced together the truth. Arnegunde had been embalmed with a plant-based fluid, likely poured down her throat after death. Her copper belt, still wrapped around her body, helped preserve the lung due to copper's antimicrobial properties. The result? One perfectly intact organ, while everything else vanished. The discovery left archaeologists stunned. What other lost embalming techniques from history might still be waiting to be uncovered? And how many other bodies have decomposed, leaving just a single haunting reminder of their existence? Number 3. Bones in a tree. A winter storm in 2015 knocked over a 215-year-old beech tree in Collooney, Ireland. But it wasn't just the roots that came up, it was human bones. A skeleton, twisted in the roots, had been trapped beneath the tree for centuries. Analysis revealed the remains belonged to a young man who lived sometime between 1030 and 1200. But what made it even creepier was the evidence of a violent death. His ribs and hands bore knife marks, suggesting he had been attacked and possibly murdered. How he ended up buried under a tree remains a mystery. Had he been given a hasty, secret burial after being killed? Was he executed and left to decay? And why had nature decided to unearth him nearly 1,000 years later? Whatever the case, this ancient cold case left researchers with more questions than answers. Number 2. Ancient cold case. Murder is nothing new, but a 430,000-year-old homicide? That's next-level history. Deep in the Atapuerca Mountains of Spain, archaeologists found a partial skull in a cave, and it had something alarming: 2 deliberate skull fractures, both inflicted by another human. This wasn't a hunting accident or a simple injury. The wounds were nearly identical, suggesting a spear or hand axe had been used, twice. In other words, this person was brutally attacked, making them one of the oldest known murder victims in human history. Even stranger, the remains were found in a mass grave with 28 other individuals, leading scientists to believe this cave may have been one of the oldest burial sites ever discovered. Who killed this person, and why were they left with the others? With no suspects, unless someone's been hiding out for 430,000 years, this remains one of humanity's oldest unsolved murders. Number 1. Cannibalism in the Canadian Arctic. In 1845, Sir John Franklin led an ill-fated Arctic expedition to navigate the Northwest Passage. But after their 2 ships, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, got trapped in ice, the crew was doomed. By 1848, 24 men were dead, and the rest set off on foot, hoping to reach a trading post. None survived. Over time, remains of the crew were discovered, but in 2015, researchers made a horrifying confirmation. The men had resorted to cannibalism. Their bones had been hacked and boiled, some cracked open to extract the marrow. It was the ultimate act of desperation. Forensic analysis even found cut marks on human skulls, suggesting the survivors were forced to strip flesh from their dead crewmates. It's one thing to imagine starvation. It's another to picture grown men, once proud explorers, reduced to breaking bones for survival. The Arctic is unforgiving, but this discovery proves just how merciless it can be. If you've enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you soon in the next